Hello and welcome to today's Heartlift with Janelle. I am Janelle and I am so happy you are joining me for the second part of my conversation with the one and only Jennifer L. Holberg. Jennifer holds a PhD from the University of Washington. She is a professor and chair of the English department at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and co-director of the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing. And I have it on my bucket list to attend their annual conference because it always looks so nourishing, pun intended, because Jennifer's newest book out this week, Nourishing Narratives, The Power of Story to Shape Our Faith. Well, you know, here in this heartlifting community, we are all about story, rewriting our story, reframing our story, and most importantly, we are about the redeeming story of Christ the Lord. In the beginning of her new book, she writes, "Thrilled by love. I once heard a speech by Catherine Patterson, the extraordinary children's writer, in which she argued that the consolation of the imagination is not imaginary consolation." Read that one more time. The consolation of the imagination is not imaginary consolation. I've thought about that phrase a good deal, especially as the violence, both rhetorical and actual, of the 21st century seems to be only worsening. After Newton and Orlando and Virginia Tech and Columbine and Charleston and Atlanta and Uvalde and that brutal, never-ending list, I have found myself both voluble and oddly inarticulate. There is so much to say, and yet so little. How can nothing change? I find that my own words feel insufficient. Patterson's assertion makes a radical claim that our Christian hope is a deeply creative act where, in our gathering together, we continually narrate the promises of a God who loves us and is making all things new. Oh, that bears repeating. I'm going to read that again. Patterson's assertion makes a radical claim that our Christian hope is a deeply creative act where in our gathering together, we continually narrate the promises of a God who loves us and is making all things new. Of course, we only see part of the story, and then dimly. And the challenge is that we must imagine the what is to be in the midst of the horrific what is. But nevertheless, the invitation to live into a different story, yes, the invitation to live into a different story, to imagine something so diametrically opposed to most of the lessons that everything around us seems to be aiming to teach us, is not a call to false hope. Indeed, it is the only way to any sense of peace. Whew. I'm so grateful for the wisdom of Jennifer Holberg in this book, Nourishing Narratives. We have so much to learn from her, this wise woman, this professor who has spent 25 years of her life training students to think and to be literate and to be able to expound on their faith. It's just so inspiring to me. And so I want us to listen with both ears wide open and eyes open and hands, everything in a state and posture of openness to this part 2 of my conversation, and listen closely for an invitation to live into a different story. We have the privilege to participate in writing our story with God Almighty Himself. I really want us to pick up our pens. I am so passionate right now because there are so many things in my life that I want to rewrite still. I want to write a new story. I want to write a different story. I want to put away toxic narratives and limiting beliefs and unleash in my life the power, like I say in Stronger Every Day, my most recent book. Let us unleash the lavish, limitless, beautiful, powerful beliefs that God has spoken over us. Okay, are you ready? I am. Let's welcome back Jennifer as she begins to talk and share with us about another tremendous influence on her own personal literacy and passion for writing and literature and all things words, her Grandma Klein. Grandma Klein as well was an incredible, look at your face just light up.
Oh, my grandmother Klein was, I think in a different era, probably would have been a college professor too, but she was someone who was very hungry for education. She actually lived outside of Des Moines and hired herself out as like an au pair so she could come into Des Moines and like work for these people and go to high school, and then got her credential to be a country school teacher, which she did for a number of years.
How beautiful.
But she loved to read from the she was the oldest of 12, and all her siblings talked about that. And she would always say to me, make sure you always have at least one book in your purse.
Love it. So she passed on not only her teaching DNA, but her literacy DNA, for sure. Mm-hmm.
And in her house, the whole house, as I talk about in the book, when you walked in her house, it smelled like you were in a used bookstore.
Okay, I have to read it. Because you write it so well. You go, this is a lesson of which even at 11 years old, I'd been an eager pupil for a long time. For one thing, I mean, Heartlifters, I hope you're sipping a cup of hot tea or something. And I just want you to just let these words ring over you and just bring you joy. Like just bring a pause in your day. For one thing, I had a grandmother who was well known for her devotion to books. My Grandma Klein's house smelled exactly like a very lovely used bookshop. I can smell it. You're making me smell it. Most rooms in her house featured floor-to-ceiling bookcases with volumes overflowing the shelves' bounds. In her basement, each room was filled with canning shelves so that the books could be placed too deep on them. Many of her books were from the 19th or first half of the 20th century, and on my family visits, I would spend hours combing the shelves, discovering all manner of Victorian literature, tales of faraway missionaries, and theological treatises, histories of places and events of which I had never heard, cookery books, and more. A whole library's worth of subjects. She had so many books that she kept at least one grocery sack by her front door with those she had either read or of which she had inadvertently bought doubles. Oh my goodness. Visitors to her house always spent time finding at least one volume to take with them. Reading as hospitality. Oh my goodness. I'm going to let you get the book and finish reading. Oh, Heartlifters, I had so much fun in this interview, and you can see the full, unedited video interview over on YouTube. But for the sake of time, I wanted to just reinforce another aspect of nourishing narratives and Jennifer's heart. She writes, but it wasn't just my grandmother and Anquanita Ash who taught me these practices of reading. So did a family life characterized by nightly communal novel and Bible reading, church and Sunday school experiences replete with both tale and interpretation, and scads of Bible memorization. Indeed, I had a story-shaped childhood. A story-shaped childhood. It is doubtless little wonder that I became an English professor. But no matter what one's childhood, even if one was not or is not really much of a reader, we are all profoundly story-shaped people. I love the coinage of that. Story-shaped people. We live in a world that, for better or worse, most often seems to process through narrative, not facts. I think as you dwell on this, you're going to see how true that statement really is. Think about it, she says. From the time we are children, we use stories to imagine the possibilities life may offer us. Consider the stories you have told yourself over the years about what you would like to be or hope to do, what job you would have, where you might travel, what your wedding would look like, how many children or grandchildren you would have. Right now, I'd wager you could tell me a story about what you think this next year will bring. Love this. We know the reverse is true as well. We can probably all think of examples of people whose lives get stuck because they can't imagine a different narrative for their lives. They can't imagine living out a different storyline. I wonder if that resonates with you. It certainly resonates inside of me today. She's really challenging me to look at the narratives that I am carrying around in my mind, my soul, and my body. Are they nourishing my life? Are they life-giving? Are they bringing meaning? Or are they perhaps toxic, limiting, negative, harsh? You fill in that blank. She writes, think how many times you've heard someone say, particularly after a disappointment or a sudden tragedy or in the middle of a midlife crisis, that's not what was supposed to happen. Wow. Without dismissing the shock and sadness of these situations, I suggest it is telling that such a comment implies the existence of a story we all narrate to ourselves constantly, and how strongly it shapes our own responses. Jennifer and I had a beautiful discussion about her chapter, Our Little Systems, chapter 6, in which she writes profoundly about the state of our church, the state of our nation, and how our personal stories inform our communal stories. So I read from page 126. Evil, Flannery O'Connor once observed, is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be endured. If that is so, endurance certainly seems to have been strenuously called upon in these last years of this global pandemic. She writes, I have a history degree and I'm a Calvinist, so I'm not so naive as to not understand that such has it always been. And yet, the magnitude of violence, the hostile disregard for each other, the fragmentation and fraying of our social bonds, the persistent calamity of climate, the oppression of poverty and abuse of systems of race and gender, and so much more must be taken into account in the stories we tell. So far in this book, we've been considering how narrative can make us more capacious in our approach to God and to ourselves. But equally important is the way story can provide a corrective, a way to deal with despair, defeat, and death in a nuanced way. She continues, it's why it bothers me so deeply when after most any tragedy, the press is full of pronouncements by self-identified Christians as to the reasons behind it. Such statements run the gamut from, I think we have turned our back on the scripture and on God Almighty, and he has allowed judgment to fall on us, to, we have systematically removed God from our schools, so should we be so surprised that schools would become a place of carnage? Or the perennial favorite, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes we get the unfortunate, God needed an angel. Such words flow after seemingly every tornado, flood, and hurricane, after plane crashes and car wrecks, after tsunamis and during pandemics, after any inexplicable horror, or worse, after anything of which the speaker disapproves. It is then we hear some Christian explain how, insert the terrible thing here, is God's divine decree. She writes, I'm just tired of it. not simply because I disagree with the theology, but because of the hubris of it all and the witness it gives of a faith that is presumptuous and triumphalist, smug and self-righteous. Every time I hear someone talk about God's will, God's judgment, God's whatever, I think of how Denise Levertov rues the confident way we speak of God's wishes, but then reminds us, perhaps God wants something quite different, or nothing at all. How confidently indeed. That's not to assert we can say nothing about God and God's ways. I certainly don't believe that. But when we consider the stories we tell, I nevertheless think we would do well to pay attention to narrative models that lead us toward humility and away from self-congratulation. Here's where our conversation led us. Trauma.
All of the conflict that is characterizing us in our church, right?
Yeah,
So we
yes.
think about people within the church who are on very different political parts of the political spectrum,
Polar.
and we seem to have forgotten that we actually do believe in the same Jesus.
We do.
And so how does the stories, those stories that the Bible gives us,
Yes.
come higher than those other stories that are not unimportant?
No.
And are not something that we should give each other freedom of conscience on, but that as I think about someone and think, I can't believe that guy would, dot, 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 and that's on both sides, right? That I've lost the idea that they are a beloved child of God.
Yes,
and
you are so
how
right.
do I think about that? How do I have my Christian faith continue to convict me about my dismissal of someone who perhaps doesn't share my same political point of view? And how do I continue to say, no, the Bible calls me to this though,
It
and
does.
I have to think about, right? And so I think about that. So one is called systems. That's really mostly about grief and loss and lament, and how do we tell the right stories about that, where we acknowledge it but we still are hopeful, because I do think that as Frederick Buechner says, death is not the final word. It's only the next to the last.
Yes.
And so how do we live into that? The way we think generationally. So that verse in Psalms about one generation will testify of your works to each other, tell the story, in other words. I always thought of that verse as old people talking to young people. One generation will tell you. But if you actually read that verse, we should be learning both ways.
Yeah.
And all the ways.
Generational.
Right. So often I think younger people, whether they're millennials or Gen Z or now alphas or whatever the next ones are going to be, we dismiss them, right? Oh, they're blah, blah, blah. But of course, as someone who's worked with them for 25 years and beyond, there's so much we need to be thinking about and listening to. And hearing their stories and understanding why they might be participating in the world and in the church in ways that maybe me as a Gen Xer or you as a
baby boomer,
right? Yeah, that our experiences of the world and our stories, we need to be telling them. But we also need to be telling about the mighty acts of God, right?
We do.
That there's this thing. I mean, one of the things I think that's a gift of middle age is such has it ever been. So when you're upset about this, yep, it was like that when I was in the 80s. It was like that in the 70s. And we still need to keep working.
It's a golden thread.
Also, not as much. So back to the
important failures.
Important failures. One of the things I do on the first day in a lot of my literature classes is, because I teach students that are general education students, right? They're taking it for a core curriculum credit. And so I say, why do you think that as an engineer or as a business person or as a nurse or a fine artist or whatever, why are we making you take a literature class? Right. And I put up on the screen a painting. And I say, well, what do you notice in the painting? Well, there's an ocean and there's a city and there's a little boat and there's a guy plowing. And they always say, oh, the guy in the red shirt who's plowing in the front. And I say, okay, good, but keep looking. And if you look over on this corner, you'll see two little legs popping up out of the ocean. Oh. And finally someone will say, wait a second, are those legs over there? And I'll say, yes, because this poem is actually by Peter Bruegel, the Dutch painter, and it's called The Fall of Icarus. Well, then we review what the story of Icarus was, right? That Icarus and his father are imprisoned and they escape by building wings. And the dad says, don't fly too close to the sun or your wings will melt. And the son, of course, is like, oh, but I'm a young guy and that seems fun and flying. And of course, he plummets. Well, the painting is just after he's plummeted and his legs are up in the air. But what's curious is no one in the painting has turned their head.
Oh.
In fact, there's a guy right on the shore that
Not
has
even
his
looking?
head down.
Oh,
Correct. And if you think about the painting, I'm like, now let's rewind the painting. Literally 10 seconds ago, this guy was probably yelling as he goes, and literally no one looks up. That seems weird.
I'm
right?
leaning in.
Well, W.H. Auden, who's a 20th century poet, he wrote a really famous poem called Musée des Beaux-Arts, where he's talking about seeing this painting, and he says this incredible line. He says, for them, they don't. He notices that they don't look up, and he says, for them, it was not an important failure. For them, it was not an important failure.
Oh,
and so, right, and so then the boy dies, right?
wow.
And so I say to them, our job in a literature class, my job is to help you not only spot the legs first, right? Be attentive, look to the margin. Jesus came for the least, right? Look to the margin.
Wow.
See the drowning boy.
Yes.
And I said, you are in this class to save the drowning boy.
Oh my gosh.
I want this to be an important failure. That when you hear the story of someone else, when you see someone fall from the sky and they're drowning, that you won't only notice it, because a lot of people talk in literature that literature should make you more empathetic and it should make you like more attentive. And I'm like, both of those things are true, but also you need to read to save the drowning boy. Wow. And I'm going to teach you in this class how to see those stories and save the drowning boy. Wow. And so that's the end of chapter 1 is we read to save the drowning boy. Let's get started.
I can't. We can read that. That's in the excerpt. I think it is.
They didn't go that far.
Well, they didn't go that far.
So it only goes to 18. But it's at the very end of the first chapter. And so what I want us to think about is, yes, story is complicated, but story is not something we should be afraid of. And it's really something that you are swimming in all the time. Yes. And so what I'm hoping to give you is some gear to understand as you're looking at something and you're saying, hey, wait a second. Right. I'm disappointed because my narrative expectation was but also that story can be so powerful as we engage people, as we think about our work as Christians in the world. Yes. Part of it is I see you and you are valuable enough to save. That's you are valuable enough that I'm going to lift my head up. I'm going to stop plowing and pull you out of the water. I'm not going to let you drown. Right. Jesus wants me to see you. He does. And to help in the redemption. He does. Right. And so that's what the book's about.
Well, that is unexpected, actually. Was not expecting that, but that is powerful. And if I have your permission, I probably want to talk a little bit more about that and offer some more wisdom from your book.
Would be happy to talk to you at any point. You are a delight.
Okay. Thank you.
As I say, your enthusiasm is really like such a blessing to me. Because as you know, from writing your own things, you sit and write it and you think, well, I like it, but will anybody else? And
they will. I promise you. This will be a textbook in many, many colleges, I would think. It should be. If it's not, it should be.
And I really thank you. That's very kind. And I really do hope that people in book clubs, people in Sunday schools, really think about the ways in which to be more critical about the kinds of things that we've just received. Because the other big mantra I say to my students is narrative normalizes.
It does.
Right? And that's good and bad. So, but I often say to them, if you think about all the ways in which social behavior changes, not because of law, right? Not because of law, not because of threat of punishment or anything like that, but it's because the story changed. So I say, if you see a person smoke in a movie now, who are they? And they say the villain. I'm like, yeah, but when I was growing up,
oh goodness,
that was the bad boy. That was he was still attractive. Now,
Oh, yeah.
no. Then we
Right.
go back to the 40s or the
40s
50s.
and 50s, everybody's smoking.
Everybody, right?
Absolutely.
And women, men, and it's a sign.
Everybody.
Right? And I say, so what changed was nothing changed about smoking. But the story changed
The story
about
did
its
change.
social acceptability.
That's correct.
Drunk driving, same thing, right?
Yeah.
We certainly have laws, but what changed about drunk driving was the social acceptability of doing that.
That's right.
And I think you can start going through a million examples.
You can. Yes.
And some of them are good, good that we don't also, that we're healthier. But there's a lot of other ones where you're like, that story changed and we got used to something because we got used to the story. And that's really not the story of the Bible. And that's really not the theology that God gives to us.
That's right.
And so if we have to keep putting the sort of, filter over each other and say, okay, are these still lining up?
Right.
Or am I absorbing things? Are the metaphors I think in, are the stories I think in, are the things I'm expecting in my church? Is that actually what we're supposed to be doing?
That's correct. Yeah.
And I think yes and no, right? And so the book is really tools to kind of help you and to suggest to you some ways that might work for you, or stories that you might use as a processing tool.
Which is fantastic. And then most importantly, I just want to leave with this, is that most importantly, it is an invitation to examine your own narrative,
right,
and then create and live in a nourishing narrative.
That's exactly right.
That's what I think. The minute I saw it, I was like, I want a nourishing narrative for this. Any time that I've left on this planet, I want to live in things that nourish me. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Such a blessing to be with you today. And
so great.
Thanks again. And thank you for all your work and the spirit of wanting to be a Heartlifter.
Yes.
That's a story we need to tell, that's a valuable thing. So God bless you.